June 19, 2026, 11:47 p.m. local time. Somewhere over the Caspian corridor, two Ukrainian Su-24M strike aircraft cross into the final phase of their attack run. Below them, 1,500 kilometers from the front lines, the Orenburg gas processing megaplant hums in the darkness. 340 hectares of compression stations, liquefaction towers, and export pipelines. Russia's crown jewel of energy infrastructure. Untouchable, Moscow had insisted. Beyond Ukrainian reach. The first Storm Shadow missile leaves its pylon at 11:51 p.m. By midnight, 3 compression stations are burning at once. By 3 a.m., fire columns are visible from 40 kilometers away. Russian emergency services spend 72 hours fighting the blaze. When it's finally out, satellite imagery confirms what Moscow desperately tried to deny. 2 compression units destroyed, beyond any realistic prospect of repair. This is the story of the deepest precision strike Ukraine has ever executed. Not a raid on a border region, not a hit on a facility within drone range. A coordinated, multi-wave Storm Shadow assault on a target that Russia's entire strategic doctrine declared immune. Tonight on WarVector, we break down every phase. The intelligence operation that made it possible. The technical challenge of flying precision munitions, 1,500 kilometers into Russian airspace, and the political shockwave that followed when the fires refused to go out. I'm your host at WarVector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What happened on the night of June 19, 2026, above the Orenburg steppe, wasn't luck or improvisation. It was the product of weeks of satellite passes, intercepted logistics data, and one critical vulnerability that Russian air defense planners had never bothered to close, a gap they assumed would never matter, an assumption that cost Russia its most important gas facility in the Ural-Volga region. Stay with us, because what comes in the next segment, the intelligence breakthrough that made this strike geometrically possible, is the part nobody in Moscow has been willing to explain publicly. It changes everything you think you know about the limits of Ukrainian long-range strike capability. To understand why Orenburg mattered, you need to understand what that plant actually was. The Orenburg gas processing complex is not simply a large facility. It is the central node of Russia's entire eastern LNG processing network. Built across 3 construction phases between 1974 and 1989, expanded through the 2000s with German and French industrial equipment, the plant processes approximately 45 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually. That gas feeds 3 distinct export pipelines, 2 domestic heating distribution networks serving 5 Russian regions, and an LNG export terminal that had become increasingly critical to Russia's revenue picture after European sanctions. In the first 5 months of 2026, Orenburg accounted for an estimated 12% of Russia's total LNG export revenue. That number had grown as Ukraine and its partners systematically degraded Russian pipeline infrastructure further west. Moscow had quietly redirected more throughput to Orenburg, precisely because it felt safe. 1,500 kilometers from the nearest point of the front line, hundreds of kilometers deeper than any previous Ukrainian strike, protected in theory by S-400 batteries around Orenburg city, and by sheer physical distance. Putin had mentioned the facility in a televised economic address just 6 weeks before the strike. Domestic heating security, export reliability, industrial resilience. The plant was a prop in a larger narrative, that whatever damage the war was doing to Western Russia, the industrial heartland remained beyond reach. That narrative was about to expire. Which weapon was more decisive in this operation? A. Storm Shadow cruise missiles. B. Aerial refueling support enabling extreme range. Or C. The intelligence mapping of radar gaps. Drop your answer in the comments. We'll return to this at the end. Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, had been running passive collection against Orenburg for considerably longer than the strike itself would suggest. Analytical interest began in late October 2025, when satellite imagery analysts working with commercial platforms noticed an irregular pattern in radar emission signatures around the facility. Most major Russian industrial complexes at strategic depth maintain dedicated air defense coverage. Orenburg had an S-400 battery positioned 23 kilometers northeast of the plant, oriented primarily toward the southern approach corridor, the direction from which any threat was historically expected. What the analysts found was different. The western approach to the facility, the corridor used by commercial aviation transiting between Orenburg City's civilian airport and westbound routes, showed persistent radar coverage gaps during a recurring 2-hour window each night. Not because Russian air defenders were negligent, because the coverage pattern had been designed around a threat model that predated Ukrainian long-range strike capability. The radar geometry was optimized to detect ballistic threats coming up from the south and cruise missiles approaching at medium altitude from the west. It was not optimized to detect a low-altitude approach profile threading the commercial aviation corridor at exactly the altitude window civilian traffic occupied. I spent considerable time going through the available OSINT documentation on this approach corridor, and one detail kept coming back. The gap was not a secret. It appeared in publicly available ICAO flight corridor data. Any analyst with access to commercial aviation tracking databases and basic radar geometry modeling could have identified it. Russian air defense planners had simply assumed no adversary could exploit it at 1,500 kilometers range with the necessary precision. GER planners disagreed. The intelligence operation that followed was methodical. Ukrainian reconnaissance assets, commercial satellite passes purchased through partner channels, combined with signals intelligence from allied networks, spent approximately 6 weeks building a detailed picture of the facility's internal layout. Not just the perimeter, the specific locations of each compression station, the pipeline junction points, the control room buildings, the transformer infrastructure, the emergency shutdown system nodes. That level of targeting detail separates a strike that starts fires from a strike that destroys capability. 3 specific compression stations emerged as the priority targets: Station Gamma 7, Station Gamma 11, and the newly upgraded Station Delta 3, brought online in February 2026 and handling a disproportionate share of the facility's throughput. Destroy those 3, and you don't just damage Orenburg. You remove it from operational capacity for months, not weeks. Stay with me, because what happens in the next phase, the technical challenge of getting Storm Shadow missiles to those specific coordinates from Ukrainian airspace, is where engineering meets courage, and it nearly didn't work. The Storm Shadow, known as Scalp EG in French service, is a conventionally armed cruise missile with a range, in standard configuration, of approximately 560 kilometers. Ukraine received Storm Shadows from the United Kingdom beginning in 2023, with additional deliveries authorized through 2025. The missiles use a combination of terrain-referenced navigation, GPS, and a terminal phase infrared seeker that matches preloaded imagery of the target. They are exactly the weapon you want when you need to hit a specific building, within a specific compound, from a very long distance. The problem with Orenburg was the distance. At 1,500 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian territory, from which a Su-24M could realistically operate, the target lay nearly 3 times beyond Storm Shadow's standard range. Ukrainian strike planners had been working on solutions to this problem for months, not specifically for Orenburg, but for the general challenge of extending Ukrainian reach into Russian strategic depth. The solution had 3 components. First, aerial refueling. Ukrainian Su-24Ms had been quietly modified to accept probe and drogue refueling, and partner nations provided training and equipment that gave Ukraine a limited but functional air refueling capability, using converted Il-78 tanker assets. The refueling window extended the Su-24M's effective combat radius by several hundred kilometers, enough to reach a launch point that Storm Shadow's own range could then cover. Second, the flight profile. The Su-24Ms did not fly a direct route. They transited through a carefully selected corridor, that minimized exposure to Russian radar coverage, staying low over terrain that provided natural masking. The route added distance, but cut detection probability. Ukrainian electronic warfare assets provided additional coverage during the most exposed portions of the transit. Third, and this is the detail that Russian analysts have found most uncomfortable to acknowledge, the storm shadows themselves were programmed with a terminal approach profile that exploited the commercial aviation corridor gap. The missiles flew the last 80 kilometers at altitudes, and on headings that placed them within the radar shadow GUR analysts had identified back in October. Not invisible, but close enough, at the speed of an inbound cruise missile. Here's what stands out about this operation from a doctrinal standpoint. Ukraine was not adapting to fight the war it has. It was actively extending the conceptual limits of what its weapons can do. The Storm Shadow was not designed for 1,500-kilometer strikes. The Su-24M was not designed for probe and drogue refueling with these specific parameters. The approach corridor exploitation was not something any allied nation had specifically trained Ukrainian operators to execute. Ukrainian strike planners assembled these components from available pieces and made them work. That is applied engineering under operational pressure. How many compression stations did the strikes destroy beyond repair? A, 1, B, 2, C, all three? Hold that answer. We'll return to it in the final segment. The strike package was structured in two coordinated waves. The decision to use waves rather than a single simultaneous launch came from the targeting analysis. Compression stations are not fragile. A single storm shadow hit on a reinforced concrete compression building causes significant damage. But Russian industrial facilities of this era are built to absorb industrial accidents, explosions, fires, pressure failures, and keep functioning. To destroy compression capacity rather than simply damage it, Ukrainian planners needed each target hit multiple times in rapid succession, with the second impact arriving before emergency shutdown systems could isolate the damaged section. Wave 1 launched at 11:51 p.m. from the modified Su-24Ms operating at the extreme edge of their refueled combat radius. 3 missiles, each programmed for a different target: Station Gamma 7, Station Gamma 11, Station Delta 3. They flew the 1,500-kilometer approach in approximately 95 minutes, threading the radar geometry the GUR had mapped, descending to their terminal approach profile 80 kilometers from the facility. At 1:26 a.m. on June 20th, all 3 missiles impacted within a 47-second window. The first indication Orenburg facility operators had was an explosion at Station Gamma 7 that knocked out the primary control room's power feed. For approximately 90 seconds, operators worked by emergency lighting, trying to understand what had happened. The emergency shutdown system had partially activated, isolating Gamma 7's compression circuit, but its programming hadn't anticipated simultaneous damage across 3 nodes. The system was designed to handle one failure at a time. Wave 2 arrived 18 minutes after Wave 1. 4 additional storm shadows. 2 targeted Gamma 7 and Delta 3 for follow-up strikes against areas the first wave hadn't fully destroyed. 2 targeted the facility's primary pipeline junction hub, a reinforced above-ground structure feeding processed gas into the export network. When those 4 missiles hit, the gas pressure dynamics changed catastrophically. A rupture in the junction hub fed gas back through a compromised section of the Gamma 11 distribution manifold. The resulting secondary explosion was significantly larger than anything the Ukrainian strike package had directly produced. That secondary explosion was visible from Orenburg City, 45 kilometers to the northeast. Put yourself in the position of the Russian Regional Emergency Coordinator, receiving calls in the first 20 minutes after that secondary explosion. You have simultaneous fires at 3 locations within a 340-hectare industrial facility. Your primary communication link to the facility's control room is down. The wind is shifting east, which means the fire could spread toward the LNG storage arrays on the facility's eastern boundary. And you have no confirmed information yet about whether this was an accident or an attack. Because your air defense command is telling you they have no radar tracks of inbound threats and no missile impact reports from their engagement systems. The technical incident cover story wasn't cynicism on Russia's part. It was genuine initial confusion. Russian air defense systems had not tracked the storm shadows successfully. The first official Russian statements, issued approximately 2 hours after impact, reflected real uncertainty about what had happened. Subscribe to WarVector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, the tactics, the technology, and the strategic implications that mainstream coverage consistently misses. The firefighting response involved 340 personnel from Orenburg Regional Emergency Services, supplemented by industrial firefighting teams from the facility itself, and additional assets flown in from Chelyabinsk. Russian sources later claimed the response was effective and professional. The satellite imagery tells a more complicated story. Thermal signatures captured by commercial satellites at 6-hour intervals over the 72 hours following the strike show the fire at Station Delta 3, the newest compression unit, the most critical to current throughput, actually expanding between the 12-hour and 30-hour marks, despite the presence of firefighting assets. The secondary fire at the junction hub area remained uncontrolled for approximately 54 hours, when Russian state media finally acknowledged the incident, not as a Ukrainian strike, but as a technical failure with associated fire. They did so 48 hours after the explosions. The delay was informative on its own. Russian state media routinely covers major industrial incidents within hours. A 48-hour silence on an event this visible, at a facility this prominent in Putin's own recent public messaging, indicated active management at the highest levels of the information apparatus. Here is a take that will probably generate disagreement. Russia's decision to describe the Orenburg strike as a technical incident was strategically incoherent. The denial prevented Russian citizens and regional officials from processing the strike as an act of war, which would have generated nationalist pressure to respond more aggressively. But it simultaneously undermined state credibility, with everyone who had seen satellite imagery, the commercial footage posted to Russian social media before censorship caught it, and the smoke column visible across 4 oblasts. Russia chose the worst available option, a denial so transparent it satisfied nobody, a frank acknowledgement, framed as Ukrainian terrorism against civilian infrastructure, would have served Russian information objectives better. The choice to deny suggests the Kremlin calculated that admitting Ukrainian reach at 1,500 kilometers was more dangerous than the credibility damage from a transparently false cover story. That calculation may have been wrong. Intercepted communications from the 72-hour period following the strike, shared selectively with partner organizations by Ukrainian intelligence, paint a picture of significant operational disruption. Regional governors in 5 oblasts, dependent on Orenburg's domestic distribution network, received urgent calls from Moscow, requiring them to implement emergency fuel allocation protocols. The language used in those communications, according to sources familiar with their content, indicated the domestic heating network impact was more immediate and significant than Russian public statements acknowledged. For the 5 regions most directly dependent on the Orenburg complex's domestic distribution, Orenburg Oblast itself, Samara Oblast, Chelyabinsk Oblast, Bashkortostan, and Tatarstan, the output disruption arrived at a complicated moment. June is not winter. Heating demand is minimal, but the facilities and distribution networks that needed to be operational by October had been relying on Orenburg throughput for summer maintenance and storage filling cycles. The disruption to that pre-winter preparation cycle was the medium-term consequence Russian logistics planners found most alarming. Not the immediate June impact, but the October calculation. 2 compression units confirmed destroyed beyond repair. A third, Station Gamma 11, damaged severely enough to require major reconstruction, with estimated repair timelines running 14 to 18 months for full restoration. The facility's current operational capacity, based on satellite imagery analysis through late June 2026, sits at approximately 28 to 35% of its pre-strike throughput. Russia's energy ministry has not published revised export capacity figures since the incident. What's most striking about this case isn't the technical achievement of the strike itself. Ukrainian engineers and planners had been working toward extended range capability for months. It's the timing. Ukraine chose to execute this strike when Russian energy infrastructure was vulnerable on multiple dimensions at once. Western sanctions enforcement was tightening on LNG exports. Alternative pipeline routes were already operating above optimal capacity, and the summer maintenance window at Orenburg had left certain redundancy systems temporarily offline for scheduled servicing. Ukrainian intelligence evidently knew about that maintenance window. The strike window wasn't chosen because June 19th was symbolically significant. It was chosen because June 19th was when the facility was most vulnerable. One detail from the post-strike analysis that stuck with me: the secondary explosion at the junction hub, caused by gas pressure dynamics rather than direct missile impact, appears to have been anticipated by Ukrainian strike planners. The targeting sequence, the timing gap between Wave 1 and Wave 2, the specific choice of pipeline junction infrastructure for the second wave targets, all of it is consistent with a plan that expected the initial strikes to create the pressure conditions the follow-on missiles would exploit. That level of industrial facility modeling in a strike plan at 1,500 kilometers range is a significant step forward in Ukrainian precision targeting doctrine. If you believe tactics and technical innovation win modern wars more decisively than raw material advantage, type WarVector in the comments. Ukraine's GUR released a formal statement on June 21, 2026, 48 hours after the strikes. The statement was brief. It confirmed Ukrainian responsibility for strikes on Orenburg Oblast energy infrastructure. It characterized the operation as a direct response to Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian power generation and distribution networks. Attacks that had left millions of Ukrainian civilians without electricity during the winter of 2025-2026. And it included a single line that received considerable attention in analytical circles. This strike demonstrates that no Russian military economic infrastructure is beyond reach of Ukrainian forces. The next target has already been identified. That last sentence was not rhetorical. Ukrainian officials speaking on background in the days following the strike indicated that the Orenburg operation was one of a planned sequence of deep strike operations targeting Russian industrial infrastructure with direct connections to the war economy. The intent was not simply to damage individual facilities, it was to force Russia to divert significant air defense assets from frontline coverage to protect industrial targets at strategic depth, assets that cannot be in two places simultaneously. The strategic logic follows directly from the physical constraints of Russian air defense architecture. Russia's S-400 inventory is finite. The number of batteries capable of covering strategic depth targets simultaneously with frontline force protection is not unlimited. Every battery that moves to protect an industrial facility 1,500 kilometers from the front is a battery that isn't covering a frontline logistics node. Every battery protecting Orenburg isn't protecting Lipetsk or Voronezh. Ukrainian strike planners appear to be treating deep strikes not primarily as damage operations, but as resource allocation forcing functions, compelling Russian air defense commanders to make impossible choices between competing coverage requirements. What would NATO have done differently, given the same targeting intelligence and the same weapon systems? Comment your tactical analysis below. The most significant constraint on the Orenburg operation, and on future operations of this type, remains the Storm Shadow inventory. Ukraine's stocks are not unlimited. The United Kingdom authorized expanded deliveries through the latter half of 2025, and France provided additional Scalp-EG missiles under agreements finalized in early 2026. But a strike of this complexity, 2 waves, 7 missiles total, against a single target, represents a meaningful drawdown of finite precision munitions. This is where the operational calculus becomes genuinely difficult. Deep strikes at 1,500 kilometers impose significant per-mission costs. Aerial refueling assets are limited. Su-24M airframes are aging, and their availability rates reflect that. Each mission at this range consumes resources that aren't immediately replaceable. Ukrainian strike planners operate under real constraints. The question isn't whether they can strike at 1,500 kilometers, which Orenburg proved they can. The question is how many such strikes can be sustained, against which targets, and whether the cumulative forcing function effect on Russian air defense allocation justifies the munitions cost. The preliminary answer, based on Ukrainian official statements and available evidence, appears to be yes, but selectively. Orenburg was chosen because its symbolic and practical significance exceeded almost any alternative target at comparable range. The destruction of Putin's flagship energy security narrative, combined with a genuine 65 to 72% reduction in a critical LNG processing node's capacity, justified the resource commitment. Future deep strikes will presumably follow similar selection criteria. Targets where the disruption to Russian political messaging amplifies the physical damage beyond what the raw destruction alone would achieve. Worth considering, every previous Russian doctrine document addressing the threat of Ukrainian long-range strikes defined the threat radius as extending no further than approximately 800 to 1,000 kilometers from the front line. That doctrine was built around the technical limitations of weapons Ukraine possessed before 2024 deliveries expanded its arsenal. Orenburg didn't just damage a gas plant. It made an entire section of Russian strategic depth doctrine obsolete. Russian industrial planners who had located facilities or expanded capacity at 1,000-kilometer-plus distances from the front because they believed that depth was protection, are now working with a fundamentally different threat model. The planning disruption of that doctrinal shift ripples far beyond Orenburg itself. Will we see more strikes at this range before the conflict ends? Comment yes or no, because the answer depends on factors that military analysts are genuinely divided on, and we want to hear where you stand. The fires at Orenburg are out. The emergency crews have gone home. Russian state media has moved on, offering no further commentary on what it continues to call a technical incident. But the satellite imagery doesn't lie, and the commercial tracking data for LNG export flows out of the Orenburg distribution network doesn't lie either. 2 compression units destroyed beyond repair, a third requiring more than a year of reconstruction, a facility running at a fraction of its pre-strike capacity, and a Russian strategic depth doctrine that needs to be fundamentally rewritten. Real tactics, real consequences. WarVector. The lesson of Orenburg is precise. Depth is not defense. The assumption that physical distance from the front line provides protection holds only until it doesn't. Ukrainian planners spent weeks identifying a radar geometry gap that Russian air defense doctrine had left unaddressed because the threat model didn't require addressing it. When the threat model changed, when Ukraine acquired the refueling capability, the modified strike aircraft, and the targeting intelligence to exploit that gap, 1,500 kilometers of assumed safety collapsed in 47 seconds. Now, the answer to the question we posed earlier: how many compression stations did the strikes destroy beyond repair? The answer is B, 2. Station Gamma 7 and Station Delta 3 were confirmed destroyed beyond economically viable repair by satellite imagery analysis and available engineering assessments. Station Gamma 11 sustained severe damage, but remains reconstructible at significant cost and time. The distinction matters. Ukraine's strike package was calibrated to ensure 2 of the 3 primary compression units were genuinely removed from capacity, rather than merely damaged. That distinction between damage and destruction is precisely what the 2-wave timing and the follow-on infrastructure targeting were designed to achieve. 3 questions worth sitting with. Was Ukraine's decision to target energy infrastructure at 1,500 kilometers the right strategic choice? given the finite precision munitions it consumes. Could Russia have prevented this strike with a different air defense posture? And if so, why didn't it? And what would you have done differently if you had been the Ukrainian strike planner working this target for 6 weeks? This strike will be studied. The integration of aerial refueling with Storm Shadow's terminal guidance. The exploitation of commercial aviation radar corridors. The two-wave timing designed to create secondary explosions from industrial gas pressure dynamics. These are not improvised tactics. They are doctrine. Ukrainian doctrine. Developed under fire, field-tested at 1,500 kilometers, and now part of the operational playbook for the next phase of this war. Subscribe to WarVector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The steppe around Orenburg is quiet now. The smoke has cleared, but the compression units are cold and silent, and the export pipelines that were supposed to prove Russia's industrial heartland was beyond reach are running at a fraction of their rated capacity. Modern warfare punishes strategic assumptions without mercy, and the next 1,500-kilometer corridor is already being mapped. Stay vigilant.